My husband abandoned me after emergency surgery. On day 8, his housekeeper sent me one shocking message. My name is Meredith Hale. I am 38 years old. I woke up from emergency surgery to remove a ruptured appendix, groggy, stitched, and alone in a recovery room. And the first thing I did once the anesthesia cleared enough for me to hold a phone was call my husband Grant, who answered on the 4th ring and told me, in a voice flat with something that wasn't quite concern, that he couldn't come get me because he was already halfway to his mother's lake house for what he called a pressing family matter. I asked him what could possibly be more pressing than his wife being discharged from the hospital after surgery. He said his mother needed him, that I'd manage fine with a car service, and that he'd check in when he could. He hung up before I could answer. Car service brought me home to an empty house, and I spent the next 8 days recovering alone, changing my own dressings, climbing the stairs one slow step at a time while gripping the railing, with nothing from Grant but a handful of one-line texts that read more like status updates to a stranger than words from a husband. On the morning of day 8, I was sitting at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a message from our housekeeper, Rosa, who had just gotten off a call with Grant, and the message she sent me made my hands go still on the table. Grant hadn't asked Rosa how I was healing. He'd asked her where I was, and whether a folder of documents he'd left on the study desk had already been picked up by a courier, documents he needed signed before end of week, documents he clearly hadn't expected me to still be home to notice. Before, I tell you what was in that folder, and what it cost him, and what it cost the family that had been quietly counting on me not paying attention. Tell me what time it is right now where you're watching this, and what city you're sitting in, because the moment you stop being too tired to notice what's happening around you is the moment everything changes. If you've ever recovered from something painful while the person who was supposed to show up for you was somewhere else entirely, hit subscribe right now, because this story is for you and there are a lot more like it waiting for you here. There was one more scene from those years that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later, though it stayed lodged in my memory the way certain small cruelties do, sitting quietly for years before they suddenly make sense. It happened at Thanksgiving, 4 years into the marriage, when I spent 2 full days preparing the meal for 18 people because Diane's usual caterer had canceled at the last minute, cooking through the night, my hands raw from peeling and chopping, while Grant sat in the living room with his brother, watching football, occasionally wandering into the kitchen to ask how much longer things would take. When the meal was finally served, Diane stood at the head of the table and offered a long, warm toast about how grateful she was for family, for togetherness, for the home she'd built, and thanked by name 3 different relatives for bringing side dishes, without once mentioning that the entire meal in front of everyone had come from my hands, my 2 sleepless nights, my own grocery, budget that Grant had never offered to split. I remember sitting there, exhausted, watching everyone eat food I had made, listening to gratitude directed everywhere except toward me, and feeling a small, familiar ache settle into my chest, the kind of ache that comes from being essential and invisible in the exact same moment. I didn't say anything that night either. I smiled, passed the gravy, and told myself, the way I always did, that pointing out the omission would only make me look petty in front of people who had clearly already decided what role I played in this family, and that role, apparently, did not include being thanked out loud. I don't want to overstate the size of any single one of these moments, because none of them, on their own, would have been enough to end a marriage or start a fight with an entire family. But moments like that accumulate the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, invisible for years, until one day you look down and realize the water has grown shallow enough that you can finally see the whole riverbed clearly, every stone that settled there while you were busy keeping the surface calm. I met Grant Hale when I was 26, working as a controller for a boutique hospitality company, and he was the easygoing younger son of a family that owned a small chain of inns along the coast, a family business built by his father and, after his father's death, run jointly by Grant's mother Diane and Grant's older brother Peter, with Grant holding a minority stake he'd inherited but never actively managed. When Grant and I married 4 years later, Diane insisted, warmly and with what I mistook at the time for generosity, that I be brought on to help modernize the company's books, and within 2 years I had rebuilt their entire accounting system, renegotiated 3 vendor contracts that saved the business real money, and quietly become the only person in that family who actually understood where every dollar in the company went. I want to be honest about something that took me a long time to admit to myself, which is that from the very beginning, my competence was treated less like a gift to the family and more like a resource to be used, the way you'd use a good tool and then set it back down in the drawer once the job was done. I remember 3 years into the marriage, sitting at a family dinner where Diane spent 20 minutes praising Peter's newest inn renovation, a project I had actually structured the financing for without once mentioning my name, and when I gently pointed out that I'd handled the loan restructuring that made the renovation possible, Diane smiled and said, "Of course, dear, you're always so helpful with the details," in a tone that made helpful sound smaller than it should have. I let that comment go, the way I let most comments like it go, because keeping peace in that family felt, for years, like the price of being included in it at all. A year later, I asked Grant directly whether I could be given a small equity stake in the family company, given how much unpaid work I had put into stabilizing its finances over the years. And Grant told me, almost apologetically, that his mother felt ownership should stay strictly within the bloodline, and that my contributions, while appreciated, were something the family valued as support rather than as a basis for formal ownership. Remember standing in our kitchen holding a mug of tea that had gone cold in my hands, feeling something in my chest tighten the way it does when you realize, all at once, that a room you thought you belonged in was actually just a hallway you'd been allowed to stand in. I didn't fight it. I told myself that marriage meant flexibility, that not everything needed to be formalized to be real, and I kept doing the work anyway, quietly, because some part of me still believed that consistency would eventually be recognized even without a title attached to it. The moment that finally cracked something open in me happened 2 years before my surgery, when Diane was hospitalized briefly for a minor cardiac procedure and I organized her entire recovery without being asked, meal deliveries, a rotating schedule of family visits, a temporary home health aide, coordinating all of it from my own office between client calls, while Grant showed up twice for a total of maybe 90 minutes across her entire 10-day recovery. When Diane was discharged, she thanked Grant in front of the whole family for being such an attentive son and mentioned me only once, in passing, as the one who'd handled the logistics, the same word Diane had used for my financing work years earlier, the same small, tidy box she always seemed to have ready for anything I did that didn't fit the story she preferred to tell about her family. I sat in the corner of that hospital room and made a private decision, the kind nobody around me noticed happening. I decided that I would keep showing up because that was who I was, but I would stop expecting my showing up to ever be seen the way it deserved to be seen, and I would start keeping my own records of exactly what I did and exactly what I was worth. Because clearly nobody else in that family intended to keep an honest account of it for me. I didn't know yet how important that decision would become, or how soon I would need every page of it. When my own surgery happened 2 years later, and Grant left for his mother's lake house instead of driving me home, some old, tired part of me almost accepted it as simply more of the same pattern, another small unfairness to swallow and move past. But I was 38 years old, Alone in a kitchen 8 days later, holding a phone with Rosa's message glowing on the screen, and for the first time in a decade of marriage, the tired part of me went quiet, and a different part, colder and far more precise, stepped forward instead. Before I go further, I want to describe what those 8 days alone actually looked like, because the texture of them matters to everything that came after. The way the specific weight of a thing matters more than simply being told it was heavy. The house was too quiet in a way that made every small sound feel enormous. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen at 2 a.m. while I sat at the bottom of the stairs, unable to make it up to the bedroom on the first attempt, resting with my hand pressed flat against my abdomen, counting breaths until the sharpest part of the pain passed. Rosa came on her regular Tuesday and Friday schedule and, without being asked, started coming an extra day that first week, quietly restocking the refrigerator with soft foods, refilling the water pitcher by my bed, asking nothing in return. And I remember thinking, somewhere in the haze of pain medication, that the person showing up consistently for me that week wasn't the man I had married. It was a woman I paid to clean my house twice a month. On day 4, Grant texted a single line asking whether the insurance paperwork from the hospital had come in the mail yet. No question about how I was sleeping, no question about the pain, only a question about paperwork. And I remember staring at that message for a long time before typing back a short, flat answer, because some tired, self-protective part of me had already stopped expecting anything warmer. On day 6, I finally worked up the strength to walk to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, moving slowly, one hand braced against my side, and found, among the usual bills, a thick envelope from a title company addressed to Grant, which I set on the kitchen counter without opening, respecting a boundary he had certainly never extended to me, a small detail that would matter enormously only 2 days later. On day 7, Diane called the house phone, not my cell, and left a message asking whether Grant had found time to review the paperwork from the study yet, mentioning that Peter's timeline for the expansion was getting tight, a message clearly meant for Grant that I happened to hear first because I was the only one home to answer it, and I remember standing in the kitchen listening to that message twice, some instinct telling me to write down the exact date and time before I even understood why it mattered. It was that instinct, more than anything else, that made me open the study desk drawer the next morning and finally look closely at the folder Rosa had mentioned, because a lifetime of quietly keeping records had trained some part of me to notice when the pieces of a story didn't line up, long before my conscious mind had caught up to what I was noticing. Rosa's message said Grant had asked whether a courier from Whitfield Title Services had already come by the house to collect a signed folder from the study desk, and whether I had, in Grant's words, been around much this week to notice it sitting there. I asked Rosa to describe the folder, and she told me it was a manila envelope, unmarked, that Grant had left on the desk 5 days earlier with a sticky note that said sign and leave for pickup, and that she had left it exactly where it was because it wasn't addressed to her, and she assumed it was between Grant and me. I walked into the study, my incision aching with every step, and found the envelope still sitting untouched on the desk exactly where Rosa said it would be. Inside was a single stapled document, 3 pages, titled Limited Power of Attorney, drafted by a law firm I didn't recognize, granting Grant full authority to act on my behalf regarding, and I read this section twice to make sure I understood it correctly, all matters relating to my individual retirement account, my portion of our jointly held brokerage account, and any decisions regarding my inherited stake in my late father's small commercial property in Ohio, a property that had nothing to do with the Hale family business and everything to do with my own father, who had left it to me specifically, in his own will, 3 years before he passed. There was a signature line at the bottom with my name typed beneath it, waiting, and a sticky note in Grant's handwriting on the front page that read, simply, "Get this back to me signed before Friday. Don't overthink it. Standard stuff for while you're recovering." I sat down slowly in the desk chair, the stitches, in my abdomen pulling with the motion, and read the document a third time because some part of my brain kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less alarming, and they never did. A limited power of attorney is not, by itself, an inherently sinister document. Spouses grant each other authority to manage finances during recovery periods all the time, and if Grant had walked into that kitchen 8 days earlier, sat down across from me, and explained honestly that he wanted temporary authority to keep our bills paid while I healed, I likely would have signed it without a second thought. The way I had signed so many things over the years without a second thought. What stopped me cold wasn't the document itself. It was the timing, the silence, the sticky note telling me not to overthink it, and the fact that Grant had left it behind and then disappeared for 8 days, only calling the housekeeper, not me, to check on whether it had been signed, as though the paperwork mattered to him more than whether his wife was managing to shower on her own after surgery. I am not, by nature or by training, a person who signs documents without reading every line, and something about being asked not to overthink a legal instrument that would hand someone else authority over my late father's property told me, with total clarity, that this was exactly the moment to overthink it as carefully as I possibly could. I did not sign the document. I did not call Grant to ask him about it. I photographed every page of it on my phone, time-stamped, and set the original back in the Kai. Exact position on the desk where Rosa had found it, and then I began doing what I do best, which is following a paper trail until it tells me the whole truth instead of the partial version someone wants me to accept. My first call was to my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had handled the estate transfer when my father passed, and who I trusted precisely because she had never once, in 3 years of knowing her, told me not to overthink anything. I described the document to her over the phone, read her the specific language granting authority over my IRA, my brokerage account, and the Ohio property, and asked her calmly what she made of it. Patricia was quiet for a moment and then asked me a question that reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't yet considered. She asked whether the Hale family's inn company had ever expressed interest in my father's Ohio property, since commercial property along a growing corridor outside Columbus, the kind my father had owned for over 20 years, was exactly the sort of asset a hospitality company looking to expand inland might find attractive as a leverage point for a loan or a joint venture. I told her I had no idea, and Patricia suggested gently that before I did anything else, I should pull the recent activity on my brokerage account and my IRA statements, because a power of attorney broad enough to cover investment accounts and inherited real estate in one document was unusually comprehensive for something being framed as standard stuff. I spent that evening at the kitchen table with my laptop, my incision throbbing under a heating pad, going through 3 months of account statements line by line, the same way I had gone through vendor contracts and loan documents for the Hale Company for a decade, except this time the account under review was my own life. What I found in the brokerage statement stopped my breath for a moment, the way finding a familiar name in an unfamiliar context always does. There had been 2 separate login sessions on my brokerage account portal in the 6 weeks before my surgery, both originating from an IP address I didn't recognize, both occurring late at night, and both accessing the account's beneficiary designation page without making any changes. The digital equivalent of someone walking through a house at night, checking which doors are unlocked without yet opening any of them. I called the brokerage firm's fraud department the next morning, gave them the dates, and asked for a login history report, which they agreed to provide in writing within 5 business days, standard procedure for any account holder requesting their own security records. While I waited for that report, I turned my attention to the Ohio property, calling the county recorder's office in the town where it sat. The same kind of quiet, patient records request I had learned to make years earlier working through the Hale Company's paperwork, and asked, whether any liens, easements, or ownership inquiries had been filed against the parcel in the past year. The clerk who helped me found something that made the whole picture snap into place with the same cold click I remembered from every other moment in my life when a family's private arrangement had finally shown itself in daylight. 6 weeks earlier, an attorney representing Hale Coastal Properties, the formal name of Grant's family business, had filed a preliminary title search request on my father's Ohio parcel, the exact kind of request a company files when it's evaluating a piece of property, as potential collateral for a loan or as a contribution toward a joint venture, and the request had been filed using my name and my father's estate case number, information that would have required someone with direct access to my personal estate, documents to provide. I sat in my car outside the recorder's office, engine off, printout on the passenger seat, and thought about every year I had spent structuring the Hale Company's financing, every year I had been told my contributions were help rather than ownership, and understood with total clarity what had actually been happening while I recovered alone in an empty house for 8 days. The company needed collateral to secure a substantial loan for an expansion project Peter had been publicly discussing for months, a plan to acquire 2 additional coastal properties, and my father's Ohio parcel, unencumbered, fully paid off, worth considerably more than anyone in the Hale family had ever asked me directly about, had apparently become an attractive answer to a problem the family didn't want to bring to me honestly, because bringing it to me honestly would have meant admitting they needed something from the one person they had spent a decade treating as help rather than family. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because this is the part of these stories where things usually turn loud, and I need you to understand why mine didn't. Calm, delivered with documentation in hand, is the most powerful thing in a room, and I had spent 10 years, without realizing it, training for exactly this moment. I did not confront Grant over the phone. I did not call Diane and demand an explanation. I built a file instead, the same way I would build a file for any client whose finances didn't add up. And I let the professionals, whose job it is to evaluate facts, do exactly that. Patricia drafted a formal letter to Hale Coastal Properties Corporate Counsel, notifying them that any title search, loan application, or collateral evaluation involving my individually inherited property that had been initiated without my direct written authorization would be treated as a serious legal matter, and requesting, in writing, full documentation of who at the company had authorized the request and what information had been used to file it. At the same time, I contacted the brokerage firm's fraud department again, this time with Patricia on the call, and formally flagged the 2 unauthorized login sessions as a security concern, requesting that the account be locked to any secondary access immediately, and that any devices previously granted access be reviewed and removed. The fraud department's investigation moved quickly once formal documentation was involved. The way these things always do once you stop hoping someone will do the right thing voluntarily and start requiring them to do it procedurally, and within 4 business days I had a written report showing that the 2 suspicious login sessions had originated from a laptop registered under Grant's name, using credentials that matched a password reset request submitted through my email account 9 weeks earlier. A password reset I never made and never approved. I sat with that report for a long time, the specific kind of stillness that comes from realizing the person who was supposed to protect you had instead been quietly testing the locks. 2 days before Grant finally came home, I attended, out of what I now recognize as pure strategic patience rather than obligation, a small investor preview event Peter had organized at the flagship inn to showcase the planned expansion to a handful of regional lenders, an event I almost skipped entirely before deciding that watching quietly from the back of the room would tell me more than staying home ever could. Grant was there, dressed sharper than I'd seen him in months, standing near Peter at the front of the room, nodding, along as Peter described the 2 additional coastal properties the family hoped to acquire. gesturing at a slide that mentioned, in small print at the bottom, additional collateral secured through family holdings, a phrase vague enough that none of the lenders in that room thought to ask exactly whose holdings were being referenced. Stood near the back with a glass of sparkling water I never finished, watching Grant field a question from one of the lenders about the strength of the collateral package, watching him answer with an ease and confidence that told me he had rehearsed this exact conversation, an ease that made it clear he had known about the plan to use my father's property for weeks, possibly longer, all while sending me one-line texts asking about insurance paperwork instead of asking how I was healing. Nobody in that room, gathered under soft lighting with wine glasses and a slideshow, had any idea that the collateral package being described in such confident, polished language rested partly on a document sitting untouched on a desk 60 miles away, waiting for a signature that hadn't come and, as far as I already knew, standing there that evening, never would. I left before the presentation ended, driving home slowly, my hand instinctively pressed against my healing incision on every turn, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that Grant had no idea the version of me waiting for him at home was no longer the version who simply absorbed a room's quiet unfairness and called it manageable. On the 12th day, Grant finally came home, walking in with the same easy, unbothered posture I'd watched him wear at that investor preview, calling out a casual hello as he set his bag down in the hallway, clearly having no idea that the woman waiting for him in the kitchen was no longer the version of me who signed things without reading them. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd had a chance to sign that folder on the desk, mentioning that his mother had been asking about it, and I remember the specific, ordinary calm in his voice, the tone of a man asking whether the dishwasher had been run, not a man aware that he was standing at the edge of something about to collapse under him. I told him to sit down. He sat, still mostly unconcerned, and I placed 3 things on the table in front of him, one at a time, without raising my voice. The first was a printed copy of the power of attorney document, with the specific clauses covering my IRA, my brokerage account, and the Ohio property highlighted in yellow. The second was the brokerage firm's fraud report, showing the unauthorized login sessions traced to his laptop and an unauthorized password reset on my email 9 weeks earlier. The third was the county recorder's confirmation showing a title search filed against my father's property by Hale, Coastal Properties attorney, using my estate case number 6 weeks before my surgery. I watched his face change with each document, the easy posture draining out of him 1 page at a time, the way water leaves a room once someone finally finds the drain. He started to say something about how it wasn't what it looked like, that his mother had only wanted to explore options, that nothing had actually been finalized, that he'd only left the folder for me to sign because it was simpler than explaining the whole complicated situation while I was recovering, and I let him talk until he ran out of things to say because I had learned, over years of sitting across conference tables from people trying to explain away numbers that didn't add up, that the truth eventually exhausts every excuse standing in front of it. When he finally stopped talking, I told him 3 things, calmly. The way I would deliver findings to any client at the end of an audit. I told him that Patricia had already sent formal notice to the company's corporate counsel regarding the unauthorized title search, and that the company's own attorneys, once they understood the exposure involved in having initiated a title search using someone else's estate information without consent, had a professional obligation to take that seriously, regardless of family loyalty. I told him the brokerage firm had locked my account, flagged the unauthorized access under his name specifically, and that depending on how the fraud department's final review concluded, this could move beyond a private family matter and into something with its own separate legal consequences, entirely outside my control at this point. And I told him that regardless of what happened with either of those processes, I would not be signing the power of attorney, not now, not ever, and that I would be retaining Patricia to review every joint account, every shared document, and every piece of paperwork either of us had signed over the past 10 years, because I no longer trusted that I had been given the full picture of anything in this marriage, Grant asked quietly. Whether this meant I was leaving him. I told him that wasn't a decision I needed to make in that exact moment, but that regardless of what happened between us personally, the locks on the house were being changed by the end of the week, that his access to my individual accounts was already gone, and that any further communication about the Ohio property or my finances would go through Patricia, not through a folder left on a desk with a sticky note telling me not to overthink it. The family group chat, the one used mostly for holiday coordination and photos of Diane's garden, went quiet for 2 full days after Grant apparently told his mother and brother what had happened. And then, on the 3rd day, Peter sent a message asking whether it was true that a title search had been filed on my Ohio property without my authorization. Because the company's outside counsel had just called an emergency meeting about it, and Peter wanted to understand how bad the exposure actually was before that meeting happened. I responded once, briefly stating only the facts as I knew them, that a title search had been filed using my estate case number without my consent, that my attorney had already sent formal notice, and that I wouldn't be commenting further outside of that process. And then I left the conversation, because I had learned that facts delivered once, cleanly, do more work than facts repeated under pressure. Diane called me directly 2 days later, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years, explaining that she'd never intended for things to happen this way, that she'd only wanted to explore whether my property might help the family expand, and that surely, after everything I'd done for this family over the years, I could understand that she'd only been trying to keep opportunities within reach for everyone, including me. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that keeping opportunities within reach for everyone would have meant a phone call, a conversation, an honest question asked directly to me while I was healthy enough to answer it clearly, not a legal document left on a desk during the 8 days I was recovering alone from surgery, with instructions not to overthink it. Diane didn't have a response to that, which told me more than any response could have. The company's outside counsel completed their internal review 3 weeks later, and the findings were exactly as direct as findings tend to be once real documentation is involved instead of private assumptions. The title search had been requested by an associate attorney acting on instructions relayed through Peter, who had, in turn, been told by Grant that I had verbally agreed to explore using the Ohio property as potential collateral, a claim that was simply untrue, and one that Grant could not produce any record of, because no such conversation had ever happened. The associate attorney, facing the possibility of a formal complaint for filing a title search using estate information without direct authorization from the property owner, issued a written apology through the firm and confirmed in writing that the request had been withdrawn and no further action would be taken regarding the parcel. Grant's access to any Hale Coastal Properties financial systems was quietly restricted following the review, not officially as discipline, but because the company's own compliance policy, the one I had personally helped draft years earlier during my unpaid modernization of their books, required exactly that kind of restriction whenever an employee's judgment came under formal question during an active legal review. There is a specific kind of quiet satisfaction in watching a policy you built without recognition become the exact mechanism that holds someone accountable years later. And I allowed myself that satisfaction fully without guilt because I had earned every page of the manual that made it possible. I filed for divorce 6 weeks after that conversation at the kitchen table, not out of anger, though anger had certainly been present somewhere in those weeks, but out of the same calm clarity that had carried me through every document, every phone call, every quiet request for records. I no longer trusted a marriage where my recovery from surgery had been treated as a scheduling inconvenience, and my inheritance had been treated as a resource to be quietly evaluated behind my back. And once that, trust was gone. I found I didn't particularly want to spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild it from a foundation that had never really been solid to begin with. The divorce settlement, once Patricia finished reviewing every account and every document from the past 10 years, reflected something I hadn't expected going in, which was a formal acknowledgement. Backed by a decade of financial records I had quietly kept for myself without realizing how much I'd need them, of the actual value I had contributed to the Hale family business over the years. Work that had never come with a title but had absolutely come with results. Results that were now impossible to argue away in a courtroom the way they had once been easy to minimize at a dinner table. The locksmith came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Grant moved his remaining belongings out of the house, and I stood on my own front porch, coffee in hand, listening to the quiet, satisfying click of a new deadbolt sliding into place, a sound that meant something entirely different to me now than it would have meant a year earlier. Rosa still comes twice a week, and the first thing she said to me after the divorce was finalized was that she was glad she'd sent that message about the folder, that something about the sticky note had felt wrong to her the moment she saw it, and I told her that trusting that feeling had mattered more than she would ever fully know. There is a particular kind of morning I didn't know I was missing until I finally had it, the first Saturday after the divorce papers were filed, waking up in a house with no one else's schedule to accommodate, making a single cup of coffee instead of two, sitting on the back porch in the cool morning air with my laptop and an actual sense of ownership over the hours in front of me. And I remember thinking that this exact quiet, unremarkable moment was worth more than any apology Grant could I have offered in a courtroom. I started keeping different kinds of records after that. Not the defensive, time-stamped kind I'd built during those 8 days, but simpler ones. A small notebook where I wrote down, once a week, one thing I had done for myself and one thing I was proud of. A habit that felt almost foreign at first after a decade of measuring my worth by what I had done for other people. And slowly, over months, that notebook filled with entries that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval at all. Peter reached out once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, not to apologize exactly, but to ask, somewhat awkwardly, whether I would consider consulting on the company's books on an independent contract basis, since the new controller they'd hired was struggling to make sense of the accounting structure I had built over the years, a structure so specific to the way I think about numbers that apparently nobody else could untangle it easily. I told him I would think about it. And I did think about it, seriously, for almost 2 weeks, weighing the strange, complicated pull of being asked, finally, to name my own price for work I had once given away freely, against the simple relief of having nothing left to untangle, with that family at all. In the end, I said yes, on my own terms, at my own hourly rate, with a signed contract that named exactly what I would do and exactly what I would be paid for doing it. A formality that would have felt unnecessary a decade earlier and now felt like the entire point. I want to be honest about something here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to end on a note of triumph over Grant's family. And that isn't quite the note I want to leave you with. I take no satisfaction in Peter's expansion plans being delayed, or in the awkward silence that now exists at Diane's holiday table when my name comes up. What I take satisfaction in is much smaller and much quieter than any of that. I take satisfaction in the fact that when someone tried to move my own inheritance through the shadows while I was too weak to notice, the paper trail caught it, the way it's supposed to, and I take satisfaction in the fact that I finally stopped signing things simply because someone told me not to overthink them. My house is quiet now, in a way that used to unsettle me and now simply feels like mine. I have learned slowly and expensively that self-respect and revenge look similar from a distance but feel entirely different once you're standing inside them. Revenge wants someone else to lose everything. Self-respect simply wants the truth to be visible, and then it wants you to build a life sturdy enough that nobody ever again mistakes your recovery for an inconvenience or your inheritance for a resource. So I'll leave you with the same question I sat with at that kitchen table, reading a document I was told not to overthink. Where is the line for you between trusting the people closest to you and simply not paying close enough attention? And how would you know if that line had already been crossed without your permission? Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, if any part of it felt familiar, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments what you would have done if you found that folder on the desk.